A thick film of chalky concrete coated the air above the sun-baked courtyard, where 40 Marines lay bleeding out. They were pinned by a ghost with a rifle. Every time they moved, a helmet sparked or a chest caved in. No muzzle flash, no echo, just the wet thud of high-velocity lead hitting meat. They sent the sniper team up there to kill a legend, but you can't shoot what you can't see. To break the stalemate, Jess had to stop looking for a man and start looking at the math. 4 hours. That's how long they had been cooking on the flat tar roof of a partially collapsed bakery. The temperature was hovering somewhere around 112 degrees, and the air smelled of rancid yeast, open sewage, and the sharp, sour tang of her unwashed uniform. Jess lay perfectly still, her cheek welded to the stock of her .338 Lapua. The rifle was a heavy, ugly thing, wrapped in dirty burlap and sand-colored tape. But right now, it was the only piece of the universe that made any sense. Underneath her chest, the black tar of the roof was soft, practically melting. She could feel it transferring its heat through her Kevlar, slow roasting her ribs. A single fat fly, irrationally shiny and green, kept buzzing against the rim of her shooting glasses, seeking the moisture of her eyelashes. She couldn't swat it. She couldn't even blink aggressively. Movement is death when you're hunting another sniper. Beside her, her spotter, Cole, breathed in a shallow, rhythmic hiss through his teeth. He was pressed into the shadow of a low parapet, his eye glued to a spotting scope. A bead of sweat hung precariously from the tip of his nose, catching the blinding glare of the midday sun before dropping onto the lens cap. "Talk to me, Cole," Jess whispered. Her voice sounded dry, like crushed leaves. "Nothing, Jess. Still nothing. The thermal is washing out. The ambient heat from the concrete is baking the sensors. The whole city looks like a white-hot glowing ember on this screen." Down in the street, 300 yards below and to their left, Kilo Company was dying. It was an intersection that shouldn't have been a problem, a routine patrol through a cleared sector. But the enemy had funneled them perfectly. They had used burnt-out husks of old transit buses to block the main thoroughfare, forcing the 40-man platoon into a wide, open courtyard, fronting a ruined municipal complex. The moment the last Marine stepped past the threshold of an alleyway, the first shot rang out. It wasn't a crack. It was a sonic snap, violent and physics-breaking, followed immediately by the sickening sound of a 7.62 round punching through ceramic armor and rib cage. Down in the courtyard, Jess watched the chaos unfold through the narrow, mirage-distorted tunnel of her optics. The heat waves radiating off the asphalt made the figures below dance and warp like reflections in a funhouse mirror. She saw a young lance corporal, maybe 19 years old, his face entirely devoid of color, pressed impossibly flat against the rear tire of a Humvee. He was screaming into his radio, his jaw working frantically, but up on the roof, they only heard the squawk of his transmission through Cole's earpiece. "Need suppression, goddammit. We have 3 down, I say again, 3 down in the open. We can't see the shooter." Another Marine, a sergeant by the look of his faded chevrons, made a terrible, human decision. He couldn't listen to the wet, bubbling gasps of a wounded kid lying 10 feet away in the sun. The sergeant broke cover. He lunged, kicking up a spray of pulverized glass and dirt, extending his hand. Snap. It happened so fast, her brain had to rewind the image to process it. The sergeant's head jerked violently backward. His helmet flew off, spinning like a tossed coin. He collapsed instantly, a marionette with its strings brutally severed. Jess felt a cold spasm in her gut. Her finger tightened on the trigger. A millimeter of pressure. Her breathing hitched. It wasn't righteous fury, it was nausea. She was terrified, not of dying, though that was a lingering background hum, but of failing, of lying there on this baking roof while 40 kids were systematically dismantled because she wasn't good enough to find the bastard killing them. "Where, Cole? Where the fuck is he?" she hissed, forcing her eye back into the scope, scanning the opposite skyline. Building after building, shattered windows, ripped awnings, dark, gaping doorways. The city was a jagged mouth full of rotting teeth, and every single dark cavity could hold a rifle barrel. "I didn't see dust," Cole muttered, his voice tight, suppressing the same panic she was swallowing. No muzzle flash in the shadows. He's suppressed, heavily, and he's elevated. Look at the entry angle on the sergeant. Jess shifted the reticle back to the courtyard. The sergeant was still. The entry wound was top down. The sniper was high up, but the entire eastern block was high up. It was a row of 6-story apartment complexes and a massive, hulking, brutalist structure that used to be a regional bank. "He's playing them," she said, her voice flattening out, stripping the emotion from it. "He crippled the first 3. He knew someone would try to drag them back. He's using them as cheese in a trap." Her right leg started to cramp, a slow, agonizing tightening in her calf muscle. She ignored it. She forced her heart rate down. Inhale for 4. Hold for 4. Exhale for 4. She watched the dust settle over the bodies in the courtyard. The enemy marksman was patient. He wasn't spraying. He wasn't eager. He was a professional doing a job, clocking in and pulling shifts on human lives. And right now, he was beating her. The radio crackled again. The platoon commander, a first lieutenant named Hayes, was trying to coordinate a smokescreen. "Viper 2, this is Kilo Actual. We're throwing everything we have on 3. Popping smoke, dragging the casualties back to the eastern alley. We need you to watch our windows." "Tell them no," Jess snapped at Cole. "Tell them to stay down. The wind is shifting." Cole keyed his mic. "Kilo Actual, Viper 2. Negative on the smoke. Do not move. I repeat, do not move. The crosswind in the avenue will shred the screen in seconds. You won't have cover." "I'm not sitting here watching my boys bleed to death, Viper. On 3. 1, 2. Down below, 3 green canisters arched out from behind the Humvee. They hit the pavement, hissing violently as thick, sulphurous white smoke billowed outward. For a split second, it looked like a solid wall, a safe harbor. Then the afternoon thermal drafts caught it. The wind howled down the artificial canyon of the street, tearing the smoke into wispy, useless tendrils. 2 Marines broke cover, diving for the wounded. Snap, snap. 2 shots, under 3 seconds. The first Marine went down hard, clutching his thigh. The second dove behind a concrete planter, a chunk of masonry exploding inches from his face, showering him in razor-sharp shrapnel. "Fuck!" Jess flinched, her eye coming off the scope for a fraction of a second. She pressed it back instantly. "Cole, talk." "I missed it," Cole admitted, and she could hear the bitter shame in his voice. "He's shooting through the gaps in the buildings, Jess. He's so far back in his hide, I can't even catch a shadow." She closed her eyes. The sweat stung terribly, pooling in the deep creases around her eyelids. She let the pain anchor her. She stopped looking at the windows. She stopped looking for a man in a ghillie suit or a barrel poking over a ledge. That was Hollywood garbage. A real sniper doesn't expose the barrel. They build a hide deep inside a room, shooting through a loophole, using the interior darkness to mask the flash and the walls to muffle the sound. Jess opened her eyes and looked at the environment differently. She stopped being a hunter and became an architect. "Cole, give me the impact data." "What?" "The impacts. Stop looking for the shooter. Give me the geometry of the dead." She hated saying it. It felt clinical, psychopathic even. But the math doesn't have a conscience. "Okay," Cole said. his breathing slowing as his brain engaged with numbers instead of blood. First casualty, hit in the left clavicle. Angle of entry was steep, maybe 30 degrees down. He was facing north. So the shooter is north-northeast. Jess nudged the heavy barrel of the Lapua a fraction of an inch to the right. Second casualty, the sergeant. Cole swallowed hard. Top of the helmet, center mass, but he was leaning forward. Trajectory, line it up with the Humvee tire, Cole muttered, doing the trigonometry in his head. Jess, line of sight puts him on the 4th floor or higher of the bank building, the brutalist one. She swung the reticle over to the bank. It was an ugly, square block of reinforced concrete, designed to withstand car bombs. It had narrow, slit-like windows. "I'm scanning the 4th floor. 5th floor, 6th, Jess said. "Nothing. The windows are blown out, but I don't see any movement. No disturbed dust." "Maybe he's behind a desk, a filing cabinet." She watched a plastic bag drift lazily past the face of the bank building. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long, harsh shadows across the facade. Then she noticed it. "Cole, look at the eastern face of the bank, the side facing the courtyard." "I see it. It's a solid concrete wall, no windows." "Exactly, no windows." She squinted, adjusting the parallax dial on her scope to pull the wall into razor-sharp focus. "Jess, he can't shoot through a solid wall." "Look at the shadows, Cole. Look at the sun." The afternoon sun was raking across the rough concrete, highlighting every imperfection. About 40 feet up, on what would be the 4th floor, there was a tiny black dot. It wasn't a shadow cast by a protruding piece of rebar. It was a hole, a small, ragged punch-out in the cinder block, no bigger than a fist. "Do you see that hole?" she asked, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs. "Yeah. It's a ventilation port or battle damage. It's a loophole." Jess felt a sudden, grudging respect for the man she was trying to kill. He knocked a single brick out of the exterior wall, but he's not standing behind it. "How do you know?" "Because if he was standing right behind it, the angle wouldn't let him hit the guys on the far side of the courtyard. The wall is 2 feet thick. A hole that small restricts your field of view to a narrow cone." She visualized it in her head, a cone of vision expanding outward from the hole. To get the field of fire, he has to hit the guys at the Humvee and the guys by the alley. He has to be backed up, Cole finished, the realization dawning. Way backed up. He knocked a hole in the exterior wall. Then he went deep into the building, across the room, maybe even into the hallway behind it. He knocked a second hole in an interior wall, perfectly aligned with the exterior hole. He's shooting through a tunnel of his own making. It was brilliant, and it was maddening. He was sitting in absolute darkness, 20 feet inside the building. No sunlight would ever touch his lens to create a glint. The heavy concrete walls would swallow the muzzle blast and the sound. To him, the courtyard was just a brightly lit television screen framed by a ragged circle of concrete. "We can't hit him," Cole said, his voice dropping into a hollow register of defeat. "Even if you aim for the hole, if you're off by a millimeter, the round hits the wall and shatters. And even if you thread the needle, he's probably behind a heavy cover inside. We need a laser-guided JDAM to drop that whole building. Air support is a negative. The mosque is too close. Division won't clear the strike." Jess chewed on her bottom lip, tasting salt and old copper. Down in the courtyard, a Marine began to scream. It was a high, thin, reedy sound. The kid who had been hit in the thigh was bleeding out. He was thrashing, kicking his good leg, slowly pushing himself out from behind the planter, delirious with pain. He was moving back into the sniper's cone of fire. "Jess," Cole warned, I see it. She didn't have time to wait for a miracle. She didn't have time to ask for permission. She looked at the thick, unforgiving slab of concrete on the bank building. She couldn't see the man. She could barely see the hole. "Load me an AP," Jess said, her voice shockingly calm. Cole froze. "Armor piercing? Jess, what are you doing? I can't shoot through the hole. The angle from our roof is wrong. If I aim at the hole, the bullet travels diagonally through the room and hits the far wall. It misses him completely." So I'm not going to shoot through the hole." She shifted the rifle. She ignored the cramping in her leg. She ignored the sweat stinging her eyes. She brought the crosshairs off the tiny black dot, moving them to the left, onto the blank, solid face of the concrete wall. "I'm going to shoot through the wall." Cole stared at her like she had lost her mind. The tactical radio in his ear was still spitting out the frantic, overlapping voices of dying men. But up on the roof, there was only the hiss of the wind and the metallic clack of him reluctantly racking the bolt of her rifle. Ejecting the standard hollow-point match round, he handed her a sleek, black-tipped cartridge, a tungsten carbide core armor-piercing round. Usually reserved for cracking engine blocks on moving vehicles. "Jess, you're talking about shooting blind through a 1.5 feet of reinforced Soviet-era concrete, hoping to hit a target you can't see, based on an imaginary line in your head." "Yes." She caught the round, feeling the cold, heavy brass against her sweaty palm, and slid it into the chamber. She drove the bolt forward. It locked down with a heavy, satisfying thud. "If you miss," Cole said, his voice tight, "he's going to know exactly where we are. That AP round will punch through, it'll make a noise like a freight train, and it will leave a hole pointing right back to this bakery roof. He'll shift his angle and put a round through your scope before you can cycle the bolt." "Then I better not miss." Jess settled back behind the optic. The world shrank back down to the circle of glass. She breathed in the smell of the hot rifle oil and the burning tar. Her heart was slamming against her ribs, a frantic snare drum that threatened to bounce the reticle off target. "Control. Strip it away. You are just a meat machine operating a metal machine." "Walk me through the math, Cole. Fast." Cole swallowed, pressing his eye back to his spotting scope. He was a professional. When the chips were down, he didn't argue. He worked the problem. "Okay, assuming he's a right-handed shooter. He's sitting behind the interior loophole. To get the field of view on the courtyard, the interior hole has to be set back roughly 15 feet from the exterior wall." "Agreed," she whispered. "Based on the angle of his shots into the courtyard, his barrel is pointing at a 20-degree downward angle and swept about 10 degrees to our left." Jess tracked the crosshairs across the blank grey concrete. "So if I track his barrel backward, through the loophole, he's sitting roughly 4 feet to the left of the exterior hole, and about 3 feet lower than it, deep inside the room." She moved the crosshairs. 4 feet left of the dark spot, 3 feet down. She was aiming at nothing, just a slab of grey, pockmarked stone. There was no visual feedback, no silhouette, no heat signature, just a blind wall. "Wind?" she asked. "Negligible at this distance for the .338, but the concrete is the variable," Cole said, his voice a low drone now, hyper-focused. "When that tungsten tip hits the masonry, it's going to deflect. The spin of the bullet will pull it to the right as it burrows through the material." "How much deflection?" "A guess. Through 18 inches of rebar and cinder block. Maybe 4 inches of drift to the right. Maybe 6. You have to hold left." Jess nudged the rifle left, aiming at nothing, correcting for an invisible barrier, trying to hit a ghost. It felt like trying to pick a lock with a wet noodle while wearing welding gloves. Down in the courtyard, the screaming spiked. The delirious Marine had pushed himself fully out from behind the planter. He was dragging his bloody leg, trying to crawl towards the alleyway. "He's in the open, Jess," Cole whispered, panic finally bleeding back into his voice. "The sniper is going to take him. He's acquiring the target right now." She could feel it. She could feel the enemy sniper in that dark room, shifting his rifle, his eye pressing into his scope, the crosshairs settling on the back of the crawling kid. He was exhaling. He was taking up the slack on the trigger. "I have to shoot first." "Hold him," she muttered. "Hold left. 1/4 mil down. Send it when you have it." Jess stopped breathing. The snare drum in her chest went silent. The sweat stopped stinging. The fly buzzing against her glasses ceased to exist. There was only the blank grey wall, the cold metal of the trigger against the pad of her index finger, and the sheer, desperate force of her own will. She pictured the man in the dark. She pictured the line connecting his rifle to the dying kid. She placed her crosshairs precisely where that line intersected the concrete wall, adjusted for the bullet's drift, and she broke the shot. The rifle roared, a deafening mechanical explosion that kicked her shoulder like a mule. The recoil lifted the scope off the target for a fraction of a second. The smell of burnt powder instantly flooded her sinuses. "Impact!" Cole shouted over the ringing in her ears. Jess fought the rifle back down, wrestling the scope back onto the bank building. A massive plume of pulverized grey dust was erupting from the blank concrete wall, 4 feet left and 3 feet below the loophole. The AP round had hit exactly where she held. "Did it penetrate?" she gasped, her hand already flying to the bolt, tearing it back to eject the spent brass. The hot casing flew through the air, clinking onto the tar roof. She shoved the bolt forward, chambering a second round, her eye never leaving the glass. I can't tell," Cole said. "Dust is clearing. There's a hole, a big one. The kinetic energy blew out a chunk of the facade." They waited. 1 second, 2 seconds. Down in the courtyard, the crawling Marine stopped. He looked around, confused. He was perfectly exposed. A sitting duck. 3 seconds. 4. No sonic snap. No crack. No wet thud. The courtyard was eerily, entirely silent, save for the low moans of the wounded. "Cole." "Keep your eye on the wall, Jess. He might be repositioning." Jess stared at the new hole she had punched into the concrete. The dust was drifting away on the hot wind. It looked like a dark, jagged wound in the side of the building. Then, something shifted inside the original, smaller loophole. It was subtle, just a change in the darkness, a sliver of grey light pushing through from behind. "Jess," Cole breathed, his eye plastered to the spotting scope. "Look at the primary loophole." She shifted her crosshairs, protruding just barely from the ragged edge of the original hole, catching a single glint of the harsh afternoon sun, was the long, heavy barrel of a suppressed sniper rifle. It was resting dead on the edge of the concrete, pointing aimlessly down toward the pavement, completely unsupported. A moment later, a thick, dark liquid began to pool on the concrete sill of the loophole, slowly dripping down the exterior face of the building, staining the grey wall black. Jess slowly pulled her finger away from the trigger. Her hand was shaking so violently she could barely open the bolt to clear the weapon. The radio crackled. Lieutenant Hayes's voice, strained and disbelieving. "Viper 2, we are moving. The shooter is silent. Did you get him?" Cole leaned back from his scope, wiping a hand across his filthy, sweat-streaked face. He looked at her. There was no triumph in his eyes, just the exhausted, hollowed-out stare of a man who had just watched someone do the impossible and hated what it cost. "Yeah, Kylo Actual," Cole keyed his mic, his voice flat. "Target is neutralized. You are clear to move your wounded." Jess rolled off the rifle, onto her back, staring up at the blinding, hazy white sky. The tar burned through her shirt, her calf muscle cramped into a hard knot of agony. She let her head loll to the side, closing her eyes against the sun, and finally, for the first time in 4 hours, she took a full, deep breath of the rancid, burning air. Packing up the gear took 10 minutes. It felt like hours. Every joint in Jess's body ached from lying rigid on the concrete for half the day. When she finally forced herself to stand, her right calf seized entirely. She had to bite down on her radio wire to keep from crying out, heavily shifting her weight onto her left leg while she slammed her fist into the knotted muscle until it finally released with a dull, throbbing ache. They didn't speak as they moved toward the roof access door. The air in the stairwell of the ruined bakery hit them like a physical wall. It was stagnant, trapped heat, reeking of old plaster, urine and rat droppings. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of sunlight piercing through a bullet hole in the metal door. Every footstep they took on the metal grating echoed down the shaft. Clang, clang, clang. It sounded like a countdown. They emerged into the alleyway behind the courtyard, just as a pair of medevac strikers roared up the avenue, their heavy diesel engines vibrating the loose masonry around them. The courtyard was a slaughterhouse. Up on the roof, through the sterile circle of glass, it had been a geometry problem. Down there, at ground level, it was butcher's work. The smell hit first. It's a specific, terrible scent. Fresh blood smells violently of copper, like a handful of dirty pennies shoved into your mouth, mixed with the chemical burn of quick-clot bandages and voided bowels. A medic was kneeling in a massive pool of dark, congealing crimson, aggressively packing gauze into the shoulder of the sergeant who had broken cover earlier. The sergeant wasn't dead. Somehow the sniper's round had struck the very top edge of his ceramic plate, deflecting upward through his collarbone instead of center mass. He was pale green, staring at the sky, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, while the medic leaned his entire body weight onto the wound. Jess walked past them. She kept her eyes forward. She didn't want them to look at her, and she didn't want to look at them. She was wearing the trident on her chest, the supposed quiet professional who dropped from the sky to save the day. But she didn't feel like a savior. She felt like a mechanic who had just barely fixed a catastrophic leak after half the engine was ruined. Lieutenant Hayes was leaning against the scorched tire of the lead Humvee. He looked incredibly young. He had lost his helmet, and his blonde hair was matted with sweat and dust. His uniform was soaked in someone else's blood from the chest down. When he saw Cole and Jess approach, he pushed himself off the tire. He didn't salute. He just stared at the heavy canvas drag bag strapped to her back. "You hit him," Hayes stated. It wasn't a question. It was a flat, exhausted statement of fact. "Through the wall," Cole affirmed, his voice raspy. Hayes looked up at the brutalist facade of the bank building 300 yards away. From down there, the hole Jess had punched in the concrete looked like a tiny, insignificant scratch on a massive grey canvas. "I lost 2, Hayes said, his voice cracking on the number. He swallowed hard, trying to shove the emotion back down his throat. "Dawson and Miller, DOA. 3 more are critical. If they lose their legs, I don't—" He trailed off, staring blankly at the asphalt. "You held them together, LT," Jess said gently. It was a platitude. They both knew it, but there was nothing else to say. Hayes shook his head, rapidly blinking his eyes. He snapped back to reality, the officer training overriding the shock. "Right. Okay. The immediate threat is down, but Battalion wants eyes on the shooter. They want positive identification, and they want his hide swept for intel. We don't know who this guy was, but he bypassed every security cordon in the sector to set up that trap. "We'll push the building," Jess said. "Cole and I know the angles. Give us a fire team to watch our backs on the stairwells." "Take Griggs and his squad." Hayes pointed to 4 Marines huddled behind a concrete barricade. They looked rattled, their eyes wide, constantly scanning the upper windows even though the shooter was dead. The trauma was fresh. Every shadow was going to look like a rifle barrel to them for the rest of their lives. "Let's move," Cole said, racking the charging handle of his M4. They stepped out from behind the Humvee and began the long walk across the courtyard. It was the longest 300 yards of Jess's life. Her logical brain knew the shooter was dead. She had seen the blood pool on the concrete sill. But the primitive, lizard part of her brain was screaming at her to hit the dirt. They were totally exposed. The afternoon sun beat down on her neck. Her boots crunched over shattered glass, spent brass casings, and pieces of fragmented ceramic armor. She looked up at the bank building. The 2 holes, the enemy's careful, precise loophole, and the ragged, violent crater her tungsten round had torn, stared back down at them like a pair of dead, mismatched eyes. The heavy glass doors of the bank had been blown inward months ago. They stepped through the empty aluminum frames, transitioning from the blinding white heat of the street into the cool, cavernous gloom of the lobby. The temperature dropped at least 15 degrees in an instant. The air there was dead, heavy with the scent of mold, pulverized drywall, and the distinct, dusty smell of ancient waterlogged paper. Thick shafts of sunlight cut through the dust, illuminating a ruined interior of shattered marble teller counters and overturned metal desks. "Night vision," Griggs whispered from behind her. "Negative," Jess hissed back, keeping her rifle tucked tight into her shoulder. "Too much ambient light from the windows. It'll wash out the tubes. Use white light if you have to, but keep it brief." They moved toward the central stairwell. The architecture was classic Soviet bloc brutalism, heavy, unforgiving, and designed to last 1,000 years. The stairwell was a tight concrete spiral, offering zero cover if someone decided to drop a grenade from the top floor. "Check your corners, slow and steady," Cole muttered, taking point. They climbed. The rubber soles of their boots squeaked faintly against the dusty concrete stairs. First floor, second floor, third floor. Jess's thighs were burning. The fatigue from lying on the roof was catching up to her. The 60 pounds of gear she was carrying felt like it was actively trying to pull her backward down the stairs. She focused entirely on the patch of Kevlar on the back of Cole's neck, regulating her breathing, pushing the physical misery aside. "Fourth floor," Cole signaled with a raised fist. He slowly pushed open the heavy fire door. It groaned on rusted hinges, a sound that made Jess's teeth ache. They spilled out into a long, dark hallway. This floor had once been executive offices. The walls were lined with cheap, fake wood paneling that had blistered and peeled in the humidity. Most of the doors were hanging open, revealing rooms choked with overturned filing cabinets and debris. But one door, at the very far end of the hallway, was shut. "That's it," Jess pointed. "Northeast corner." They stacked up on the door. Griggs and his Marines held the hallway, their weapons trained on the empty doorways, while Cole and Jess prepared to breach. She leaned close to the wood. She couldn't hear any movement inside, no breathing, no rustling gear, but she could smell it. It was faint, seeping under the door gap. That same heavy, metallic scent of copper. She nodded at Cole. He gripped the door handle, tested it, and found it unlocked. He threw the door violently open, stepping back, while Jess pivoted into the doorway, her rifle sweeping the room. The blinding beam of her weapon light cutting through the gloom. "Clear right," she shouted. "Clear left," Cole followed. The room was silent. They stepped inside, their boots crunching softly on debris. It was a corner office, spacious and entirely stripped of furniture. The windows facing north had been heavily sandbagged, leaving only a tiny slit for observation. But the eastern wall, the wall facing the courtyard, was where the work had been done. It was a masterpiece of lethal engineering. The sniper had constructed a hide that was completely decoupled from the exterior environment. Roughly 15 feet back from the solid concrete exterior wall, he had built a secondary wall out of heavy oak desks dragged from other offices, stacked high and reinforced with scavenged sandbags. In the direct center of this barricade, at a seated chest height, was a gap roughly the size of a grapefruit. "Look at this," Cole whispered, stepping cautiously around a tripwire rigged to a flashbang near the doorway. He pointed his flashlight down the length of the room. If you looked through the grapefruit-sized hole in the interior barricade, your line of sight went perfectly through the empty air of the office and out through the single missing cinder block he had punched out of the exterior wall. It was a tunnel. From outside, he was completely invisible. From inside, he had a perfectly framed, restricted, and illuminated view of the kill zone. He even painted the floor, Jess noted, shining her light down. The concrete floor between his barricade and the exterior wall had been spray-painted flat black to absorb any stray light that might reflect off the ground and illuminate his face. A damp, woolen blanket hung from the ceiling above the hide, designed to catch the acoustic wave of the muzzle blast and deaden the echo. "He was a ghost," Griggs muttered from the doorway, lowering his rifle. "He could have sat here for a week, and we never would have seen a flash." Jess stepped around the heavy oak barricade to look behind it. That was where the ghost ended, and the man began. He was sitting in an old, rolling office chair, slumped heavily to the right. Jess kept her rifle trained on his chest for 5 full seconds, waiting for a twitch, a sudden intake of breath, a hand moving toward a sidearm. Nothing happened. He was perfectly, permanently still. "Target secured," she said quietly, lowering the muzzle. She stepped closer, the beam of her tactical light washing over him. The immediate reality of the violence was stark and ugly. There is absolutely nothing cinematic about what heavy ballistics do to the human body. Her math had been right. It had been horribly, perfectly right. The armor-piercing round hadn't hit him directly. It hadn't needed to. When a heavy tungsten carbide core, moving at 3,000 feet per second, strikes an 18-inch reinforced concrete wall, it doesn't just punch a neat hole. It turns the concrete itself into a shotgun blast. 4 feet to the left of his loophole, the interior wall had violently exploded inward. A massive crater of spalled concrete, rebar, and dust covered the floor. The sniper had caught the brunt of that secondary explosion. Chunks of jagged, high-velocity masonry had shredded the left side of his body. His left arm hung loosely, heavily traumatized, and his tactical vest was punctured in a dozen places by stone shrapnel. But it was the tungsten round itself that had ended it. After blowing through the concrete, its trajectory completely destabilized, the heavy projectile had tumbled sideways, striking him just under the left armpit, bypassing the ceramic plate of his armor. Jess stood there, looking at him. He wasn't a monster. He didn't look like a super soldier. He just looked like a man who had gone to work and died at his desk. He was older than she expected, mid-50s maybe. He had deep, weathered lines around his eyes and a patch of grey stubble on his chin. He was wearing faded, unbranded tactical pants, a dusty grey long-sleeve shirt, and a heavy chest rig holding 6 magazines. His rifle lay across his lap, the barrel resting gently against the edge of the loophole barricade. It was a beautiful, terrifying piece of machinery. An Accuracy International AXMC, heavily modified, wrapped in dark grey tape to blend into the shadows. A custom suppressor the size of a baseball bat was threaded onto the barrel. "Check his pockets," Cole said, his voice flat. He was already sweeping the corners of the room, looking for secondary traps or comms equipment. Jess slung her rifle over her shoulder and pulled on a pair of black nitrile gloves. She approached the body, stepping carefully over the pool of blood that had heavily soaked the rug beneath the chair. She checked his chest rig first. No ID, no unit patches. The magazines were loaded with custom, hand-pressed ammunition. Brass polished flawlessly, heavy grain bullets seated with precision. He cared about his tools. She patted down his cargo pockets. In the right one, she felt a hard, rectangular shape. She pulled it out. It was a small black moleskin notebook. She flipped it open. The pages were covered in tiny, meticulous handwritten notes. It wasn't Arabic or Russian. It was English. But it wasn't a diary. It was data. Wind value 2.4 miles per hour from north. Humidity 40%. Barometric pressure dropping. Target distance 312 meters. Hold point 2 miles high. Page after page of ballistic calculations. Sketches of intersections. Diagrams of patrol routes. He had been studying Kylo Company for weeks. He had logged their movements, their vehicle spacing, their reaction times to indirect fire. He had treated the Marines like a science experiment, isolating variables until he found the perfect equation to kill them. "Anything?" Cole asked, coming up beside her. "Just math," Jess said, handing him the notebook. She looked back down at the dead man. Tucked behind the notebook in his pocket had been something else. A small, crumpled foil wrapper. She picked it up. It was a half-eaten protein bar. Peanut butter and chocolate. The exact same brand that was currently sitting in the bottom of her assault pack. Jess stared at the foil wrapper, feeling a sudden heavy knot form in her stomach. The absurdity of it was suffocating. They were two completely opposing forces, standing on opposite sides of a war, trying to murder each other from hundreds of yards away using geometry and physics. Yet, they both sat in the dark, sweating, calculating wind drift, eating the exact same cheap peanut butter protein bars. He was brilliant. He was patient. He was deadly. And she had only beaten him because she decided to shoot blindly through a wall, relying on a mathematical guess and the spin of a tungsten bullet. It wasn't skill that kept her alive today. It was luck and a few inches of spalled concrete. "We're done here," Jess said, dropping the wrapper onto the desk. She suddenly felt an overwhelming, desperate need to get out of this room. The smell of copper and dust was making her gag. "Grab his rifle for intel. Let the Marines bag the body." Cole nodded, slinging the massive sniper rifle over his back. Jess walked out of the office, past Griggs and his wide-eyed Marines, and started back down the dark hallway. Her right leg cramped again, a sharp spike of pain shooting up to her hip. She limped slightly, leaning her hand against the peeling wood paneling of the wall for support. She had killed the legend. She had saved the platoon. But as she walked back down into the sweltering heat of the ruined city, she didn't feel like a hero. She just felt tired, incredibly thirsty, and entirely aware that somewhere out there, in another dark room, another man with a notebook was probably doing the math on her. The ride back to the forward operating base was a sensory deprivation tank built out of rattling steel and diesel fumes. They sat in the cramped troop compartment of a striker, the heavy armor plates vibrating against Jess's spine, with every pothole and piece of debris, the 8 massive tires crushed. Nobody spoke. Griggs and his remaining Marines sat across from Cole and Jess, their eyes vacant, staring at the diamond plate floorboards. The adrenaline had finally burned out, leaving nothing but a toxic sludge of cortisol and exhaustion in their bloodstreams. One of the young privates, a kid who looked barely old enough to buy lottery tickets, was unconsciously scratching at a small, dried fleck of the sergeant's blood on his knee pad. He just kept scraping his fingernail over it, back and forth, a rhythmic, desperate little motion. Jess leaned her head against the cold steel of the hull and closed her eyes. Her right shoulder throbbed with a dull, persistent ache from the .338's recoil. Her mouth tasted sour. Every time the striker hit a bump, her stomach rolled. She wasn't car-sick. She was coming down from the high of surviving, and the crash was brutal. They rolled through the fortified gates of FOB Restrepo just as the sun dipped below the concrete blast walls, painting the dusty sky in bruised shades of purple and sickly orange. Stepping out of the armored vehicle was like stepping onto another planet. Inside the wire, the war was sanitized. Generators hummed a constant, low-frequency drone. Soldiers in clean t-shirts and gym shorts were jogging along the perimeter path. Someone was blasting aggressive country music from a portable speaker near the motor pool. It was surreal. 3 miles away, men were bleeding to death on melting asphalt. And here, a mechanic was complaining about a broken vending machine. "Viper 2 TOC wants you in for debrief," a comms specialist yelled, jogging up to them before they even had their helmets off. Cole grunted, slinging the dead sniper's captured AXMC rifle over his shoulder like a heavy bag of golf clubs. "Give us 10 minutes to stow our gear and grab water." "Major said now, Sergeant. Intel is salivating over that weapon." Jess unclipped her chin strap and let her helmet drop from her hand. It hit the dust with a heavy thud. Her hair was plastered to her skull with sweat, rigid with salt and drywall dust. She didn't care. She started walking toward the Tactical Operations Center, dragging her feet, letting the heavy canvas drag bag scrape against the gravel. The TOC was a massive, climate-controlled tent complex hidden behind a secondary wall of HESCO barriers. Pushing through the heavy vinyl flap was a physical shock. The air conditioning was set to meat locker temperatures to keep the server racks from melting down. The air inside smelled sharply of ozone, stale coffee, and pine sol floor cleaner. It was so bright it made her eyes water. Major Caldwell was standing by a digital map table. He was a compact, highly caffeinated man who treated combat like a competitive spreadsheet. Beside him was Captain Donovan, the battalion intel officer, literally bouncing on his heels. "Drop it here," Donovan said, pointing to a plastic folding table. He was staring at the captured rifle on Cole's back, like a kid looking at a new bicycle. Cole swung the heavy weapon off his shoulder and laid it gently on the plastic. It looked alien in the sterile, fluorescent light of the tent. The dark grey tape, the massive suppressor, the custom-molded grip. It was a tool built for one highly specific, terrible purpose. "Outstanding work, Jess," Caldwell said, looking up from the map. He held a half-empty can of energy drink, tapping his wedding ring against the aluminum. "Kilo Company is calling you the guardian angel of the sector. You broke a total stalemate. Walk me through the shot." Jess stared at the energy drink. It was a bright, obnoxious neon green. The smell of fake tropical fruit drifted across the table, mixing with the pine sol. Her stomach clamped down violently. She had to swallow a mouthful of thick, bitter saliva to keep from throwing up right there on the map table. "There wasn't a line of sight, sir," she said, her voice sounding flat and distant, like she was listening to someone else speak. "He had a secondary hide built 15 feet deep into the 4th-floor office. I calculated his position based on the entry angles of Kilo's casualties and shot an AP round through the exterior concrete wall." Caldwell stopped tapping his ring. Donovan looked up from the rifle, his brow furrowed. "You shot through a solid wall?" Caldwell asked, the enthusiastic edge dropping from his voice, replaced by analytical confusion. "Blind?" "Yes, sir. What was your margin of error? I don't know, she lied. She knew exactly what it was. If she had held a millimeter further to the right, the bullet would have missed the sniper entirely, burying itself in the sandbags of his barricade. He would have adjusted, and Cole and Jess would have been dead 3 seconds later. It was a math problem, Cole interjected, stepping slightly in front of her, sensing her rigid posture. Jess ran the geometry on the fly. It was 1,000,000 to 1 shot, Major, but she made it. 1,000,000 to 1, Donovan muttered, shaking his head. He pulled on a pair of latex gloves and picked up the dead man's notebook, which Cole had tossed onto the table. Well, let's see what your ghost was writing about. Jess didn't want to be there. She didn't want to hear about the ghost. She just wanted to take her plate carrier off, stand under a stream of cold water until she couldn't feel her legs, and sleep for 3 days. But she stood there, rooted to the linoleum floor by the crushing weight of military protocol, while Donovan flipped open the black moleskin. Wow, Donovan whispered, pushing his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose. This guy wasn't just a shooter, he was an architect. The harsh overhead lights caught the meticulous graphite markings in the notebook. Donovan laid it flat so Caldwell could see. Jess kept her distance, crossing her arms over her chest armor, but she could clearly see the pages. It was a masterclass in urban warfare. The sniper had mapped out the entire grid sector. He had identified dead zones in their radio coverage. He had noted the exact response times of their quick reaction forces down to the second. He had a table charting the average ambient temperature at different times of the day to predict the severity of thermal mirage on the asphalt. Look at this, Donovan pointed to a sketch. He catalogued the patrol rotations. He knew Kylo Company favored the Eastern Avenue on Tuesdays and Thursdays. He spent 3 weeks preparing this single trap. He was hunting them, Caldwell said, his jaw tightening. He set the bait and waited. And look at the ballistic data. Donovan turned a page, completely absorbed, ignoring the heavy silence coming from Cole and Jess. He was hand-loading his own rounds, weighing his powder charges to the 1/10 of a grain. He has notes here on the aerodynamic drag of his bullets at different humidity levels. Donovan flipped another page, and then he stopped. He blinked, leaning closer to the paper. "What is it?" Caldwell asked. "It's a sketch." Jess uncrossed her arms and took a step forward, despite every instinct telling her to walk out of the tent. It wasn't a diagram of a kill zone. It wasn't a wandage chart. It was a pencil drawing of a garden. It was incredibly detailed. You could see the texture of the bark on an old fig tree. There was a low stone wall, draped in what looked like jasmine vines. In the corner of the sketch, sitting on a small wooden bench, was a rough outline of a dog, a scruffy terrier mix, asleep in the sun. Beside the drawing was a list, written in the same precise, blocky handwriting used for the ballistic tables. 1. Fix the irrigation drip line on the tomatoes. 2. Buy new fertilizer. Check the market on Friday. 3. Replace the hinges on the back gate. The breath left Jess's lungs in a slow, ragged hiss. "Huh," Donovan said, sounding almost disappointed. "Must be his home, or a place he used to live." He flipped the page, eager to get back to the lethal data. Anyway, his windage charts for the 7.62 are... "I'm done," Jess said. Her voice was louder than she intended. It echoed slightly in the quiet hum of the server room. Donovan stopped mid-sentence. Caldwell looked at her, surprised. "Excuse me, Chief?" Caldwell asked. "I gave you the debrief, Major. Target is down. Area is secure. If you don't need me to identify anything else, I need to go." Caldwell studied her face. He was a numbers guy, but he wasn't blind. He saw the pale, waxy sheen of her skin. He saw the slight tremor in her left hand where it rested against her thigh. Go. Caldwell nodded softly. Get some rest, Jess. You did good today. You saved a lot of kids. She didn't say thank you. She just turned and walked out of the tent. The heat of the evening hit her like a physical blow as she stepped past the vinyl flap. But for once, she was grateful for it. It burned away the smell of the pine sol and the Monster energy drink. She walked straight to the female latrine block. It was a plywood shack perched over a plastic holding tank. She locked the flimsy wooden door behind her, stripped off her helmet, and dropped to her knees in front of the stainless steel sink. She threw up until there was nothing left but yellow bile and the taste of chalk. She gripped the edges of the sink so hard her knuckles turned white, her chest heaving, gasping for the hot, putrid air. She closed her eyes, but the darkness behind her eyelids wasn't empty. It was filled with the image of a bloody, shattered body slumped in an office chair. A man who ate peanut butter protein bars. A man who worried about the drip line on his tomato plants. A man who spent 3 weeks meticulously calculating how to blow the heads off 19-year-old kids. War wasn't a battle of good and evil up on that roof. It was just 2 people sitting in the dark, doing math. He did his math flawlessly. She did hers with a wild, desperate guess. She won because a piece of tungsten tumbled the right way through 18 inches of concrete. Jess splashed lukewarm, heavily chlorinated water on her face, watching the dirt and sweat swirl down the drain. She stared at herself in the scratched metal mirror above the sink. She looked 10 years older than she had that morning. Her eyes were completely hollow. She didn't feel like a guardian angel. She felt like a murderer who had simply outcalculated another murderer. Jess didn't sleep that night. She lay on her narrow cot in the transient barracks, staring up at the plywood ceiling. The mattress smelled faintly of mildew and the sweat of 100 other operators who had slept there before her. A small oscillating fan in the corner of the room clicked rhythmically every time it turned to the left. Click. Whirr, click. Whirr. It sounded like the cycling of a bolt-action rifle. Cole was asleep in the bunk across from her. He was snoring softly, a deep, even rhythm. He had compartmentalized it. Cole was brilliant at that. He could put the violence in a box, lock it, and slide it under the bed until he needed it again. Jess couldn't find her box. The lid was broken. Every time she closed her eyes, she was back on the tar roof. She could feel the heat baking her ribs. She could smell the rancid yeast of the bakery. She could see the terrible, ragged hole in the brutalist facade. At 400, she gave up. She rolled out of the cot, her bare feet hitting the cold plywood floor. Her right calf was still tight, a bruised knot of muscle protesting the movement. She pulled on a clean green t-shirt and her faded desert pants, lacing her boots up in the dark by muscle memory alone. She walked over to her gear locker. Her body armor hung on a heavy wooden hanger, smelling of dust and dried sweat. She pulled it down. It weighed 35 pounds, but as she slipped it over her head and secured the Velcro cummerbund, it felt like it weighed 100. She picked up her rifle case. The .338 Lapua was inside, cleaned and oiled. Before she had tried to sleep, she had spent an hour field stripping it, scrubbing the carbon out of the chamber, wiping down the bolt face. Taking care of the machine. The machine didn't have nightmares. The machine just did what it was told. She walked out to the armory tent to draw her ammunition. The armorer was a heavily tattooed staff sergeant who looked like he had been awake for a week. He didn't ask questions. He just pushed 4 heavy cardboard boxes of match-grade hollow points across the plywood counter, and 1 single box of tungsten-core, armor-piercing rounds. Jess took the AP rounds and looked at the sleek black tips. She grabbed a magazine and began loading them, one by one. The heavy brass casings clicked sharply as she pressed them down under the feed lips. Press, click, press, click. It was a comforting, mechanical rhythm. There was no grand revelation to be found in the bottom of an ammunition box. There was no closure. Yesterday, she killed a man who liked gardening, so that a kid named Hayes could write letters to the families of Dawson and Miller, instead of his own parents getting a letter. That was the only truth out there. The ledger. You try to keep the red ink off your side of the book for as long as you can. You use gravity, wind resistance, and rotational drift to balance the equation. You look through a piece of ground glass, you hold your breath, and you subtract a life from the board. At 05:30, the sun began to rise, turning the sky the color of a fresh bruise. Cole walked out of the barracks, his armor on, his M4 slung casually across his chest. He held 2 styrofoam cups of terrible dining facility coffee. He handed one to her without a word. They stood by the concrete blast wall, drinking the bitter, burnt liquid in silence, watching the convoys line up at the gate for the morning patrols. The heavy diesel engines roared to life, mechanical beasts waking up for the day's work. "Command wants us back in Sector 4, Cole said quietly, staring out at the rising dust. "Overwatch for an engineering team repairing a water main." "Rooftop?" Jess asked, staring at the black liquid in her cup. "Yeah, 5-story residential. Good sightlines down the avenue." She nodded slowly. She dumped the rest of the coffee into the dirt. She picked up her heavy canvas drag bag, feeling the familiar, bruising weight of the rifle settle across her back. The stiffness in her leg throbbed, but she ignored it. She shoved the memory of the peanut butter wrapper and the pencil sketch deep down, locking it in a place she hoped she would never have to open again. "Let's go find a shadow," she said. They walked toward the idling striker, stepping back into the math. War strips away the glory and leaves only the math. If this raw, unfiltered look at the reality of combat resonated with you, if you appreciate stories that focus on the gritty human cost rather than Hollywood heroics, make sure to hit that like button. Share this video with someone who understands that the heaviest burdens aren't carried on a soldier's back, but in their mind. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss a drop. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Jess's shoes? See you in the next grid square.